All right, greetings everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Erin Carlson Mast, and as the CEO of President Lincoln's Cottage, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our 6th annual and first virtual Lincoln Ideas Forum. We typically hold this program inside the cottage itself each April, but 2020 had other plans. Our goal with this program each year is to take a closer look at the ideas Lincoln nurtured into action while living here, and to highlight the legacies of that unfinished work. This year's program is made possible with a sponsorship by the Hassenberg-Hartsock Group at Merrill. We thank our sponsor for their generous support. In the forum today, we will explore presidential character, traits that can fundamentally shape what ideas presidents have and how they act on them through the lens of 4 different US presidents. In our research about President Lincoln's time at the cottage, we have found numerous personal accounts that convey Lincoln's character, even when he was out of the spotlight. His humor, and his self-deprecating humor in particular, his humanity, his persuasiveness, his compassion, they all come through in the stories of his time here. Consider that the Lincolns chose to live here for over a year of his presidency. And when he did that, he was putting himself face to face with the human cost of war. Hundreds of retired and disabled veterans lived a stone's throw from the cottage, and ultimately over 8,000 Civil War burials took place just 200 yards away in the US Soldiers and Airmen's Home National Cemetery, which is the predecessor and contemporary of Arlington National Cemetery. Lincoln did not shy away from difficult decisions, from consequences, from criticism, and yet he never lost his empathy or his humor. We're delighted to have Andrew Marshall with Partnership for Public Service as our moderator for today, and to be joined by our colleagues and friends from George Washington's Mount Vernon, the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library, and the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. And thank you to my colleague, Callie Hawkins, our Director of Programming, for her thoughtful work in assembling, once again, a stellar group of people for this program. Andrew Marshall oversees the strategy, design, and delivery of the partnership's leadership development programming. His drive for developing leaders, combined with his commitment to make public servants, make this nothing short of a dream job for him. A certified executive coach, he has experience developing leaders and leadership teams in the private, nonprofit, and public sectors, from aspiring supervisors to executives. Beyond his time at the partnership, his management experience comes from years in journalism, community development, and as the executive director of a philanthropic consulting organization. A Lincoln aficionado, Andrew admires the 16th president for the way in which he created unity while celebrating diversity. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Erin, thank you so much, and welcome everybody. So glad to have you here. Looking forward to this conversation. Erin, the only fun facts I would add to that bio are that I've done my research and I am Abraham Lincoln's 3rd cousin 7 times removed. So we're pretty close. And also I've named my son, my oldest son is named Abraham. And I do have I have a passion for history, but particularly the life of Lincoln, and look forward to engaging. Just to open up, just a few remarks to open up. First, thinking about the definition of character. And if we look it up, it is the mental and moral qualities distinctive to an individual. So mental and moral qualities, let's keep that in mind as we examine the lives of these presidents and their character. If we think about Lincoln, just briefly to set the stage, he had no prominence, he had no prosperity to usher him into the national stage like so many did. He really had to build on his character. And he had been doing that from the beginning. And if I think of two basic characteristics that he brought that evolved into who he was as president, one would be his commitment. And you think you know the moniker Honest Abe. In the 1830s, he's sharing a shop. He's gone in on owning a store with a man named William Barry. Barry is an alcoholic. He dies prematurely. He leaves Lincoln with $1,000 of debt. Again, this is in the West. A lot of people would have walked away from that. Lincoln stuck it out and paid it all off and gained this moniker, Honest Abe. This is a commitment that he had to himself and his integrity that then, of course, shows up when he's running the country, when he's leading the nation and trying to bring the Union together. This full-on commitment to unity showed up in ways that were important for our country that began in very simple ways as a young man. Compassion would be another characteristic I would identify, which Aaron mentioned. We have the story of him walking through a prairie field when he's young, and he sees a pig stuck in the mud, and he walks past the pig, and then he walks past a little ways and pauses and looks back and actually looks the pig in the eye, and he says he sees a wistfulness in it. The pig was almost saying, "You were my last hope." And Lincoln can't help but walk back, get his suit dirty, and pull this pig out of the mud. This is the same person that years later is pardoning soldiers late into the night, that is working with all of his soul to end the institution of slavery. This compassion that he had as a young person turned into a big part of his leadership of our nation. And so just a couple of examples. I love the quote, particularly around his compassion, when he says, "I shall do nothing in malice. What I deal with is too vast for malicious dealing." And what a powerful statement for a leader to make. The things we're working with are too complex and vast, excuse me, for any sort of maliciousness. So as we start to explore these various leaders, these presidents, I want you to think about what you're valuing. With every president, we have the being and the doing. We have the character and the values, and we have the policy and the platforms. How are we assessing? We're obviously in the very thick of assessing that right now. But how are we assessing more broadly the character of the leaders who we are supporting through our vote or other ways? And would invite you to consider, of course, the words of Dr. King, that we're judging people by the content of their character. So as we get into this, I'll leave one more Lincoln quote, and then we'll hear from our first speaker. Lincoln said, "Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power." We're about to hear from some people who are experts in these presidents who had a whole lot of power, as much power as anyone will see in this life. And what did they do? How did it actually show their character? What did it bring out? Our first speaker here is Alison Wickens from George Washington's Mount Vernon. She leads the Education and Guest Services Division at Mount Vernon and oversees the history and civic learning goals for the institution's on-site, off-site, and digital outreach programs, which I imagine are growing all the time right now. She advises the staff and leadership about trends in research and education and learning at museums, historic sites, and schools, and has written on this subject in articles published in the Journal of Museum Education. Before arriving at Mount Vernon, she worked for over 15 years at the Smithsonian Institution. She received a master's in history and a certificate in museum studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder, and a bachelor's in history from Grinnell College. Alison, so glad to have you. Looking forward to hearing what you have to share about Washington, and the floor is yours.
And wonderful. Thank you so much to Lincoln's Cottage as well, Aaron. It's wonderful for you to open the doors to other presidents in your programming, and I'm really happy to be here. And although I'm not at Lincoln's Cottage, I'm just about 10 blocks away, so I feel pretty close. It's wonderful to be here. I wanted to talk about George Washington, and specifically the shared characteristics that I believe he had with Lincoln, although clearly we've got some great Lincoln experts here. And that was his commitment to union above all else. When we think about Lincoln's refusal to let the Confederate States secede, I think about he shared that with Washington, because Washington's commitment to union was born of war. And I think we see its origins in the American Revolution. George Washington, he is asked to lead the Continental Army during the American Revolution. And so in that position is asked to leave his identity as a Virginian and embrace the identity of somebody responsible for lives of people from all 13 of these sort of disparate colonies that joined together really under one common cause, which was to defeat the British, to, remove themselves from the British Empire. And so as Washington is pursuing this early leadership role, he's given this role as a military leader, but he gains really insight into what it means when you add 13 individual colonies and eventually states into a whole, unity, a whole. And he spends the rest of his life in public service, really committed to keeping that unity together. And one of the reasons I believe that he does that is because he saw the great sacrifice during the American Revolution that was put to that idea, to the commitment of liberty. And many of his political peers didn't have that intimate relationship with the lives lost and the sacrifice that happened during the American Revolution, to be able to commit to that union. And we see Washington specifically articulate it at the end of the revolution, before the final sort of paper and ink is signed. He sends a letter out to each of the governors of the states. We call it the circular to the states. And in this letter, he really expresses this need for the Union to stay whole. He says, we came together to fight the British, but it is time now to remember that our Union is something bigger than that. It's bigger than just our common enemy, that we fought for an idea, and that we have to be intentional about working together if we're going to maintain this union. Because remember, at this time, the states had all the power, and the Articles of Confederation, which was the government at that time, was not a strong central government. And so Washington is putting basically a plea to the states to say, remember your commitment to this union. So Washington, I think he is able to pursue this commitment to union through his career because he's garnered respect and trust from those he considers his peers in this revolutionary fight. And part of that has to do with his early life, and I won't go too much into it, but from the point he was chastised as a younger man for his hot temper and his sort of quick to react, and he becomes sort of self-imposed, someone who is going to listen before he acts, someone who is going to take in other people's perspectives, and follows sort of this chivalry rules of a different era. And in that aspect, he gains a lot of trust from his peers, even when they disagree with him. He was seen as key to the Constitutional Convention. His presence there meant that everybody else, except for those guys from Rhode Island, would be a part of that conversation because they trusted Washington would make sure that all of the voices were heard in terms of the representatives from the states. And part of the reason he had this trust in people was because he had given up power after the American Revolution, when he held the military, and the military was hoping that he would take a leadership role. And he said, no, the civilian government is in charge here. We need to, once again, commit to this union and this idea that we fought for, that the civilian self-governance is the one responsible for control. Now, another reason he garnered respect at this time is something that doesn't translate very well to today, but was worth noting, and that's that he was independently wealthy. And it was seen in this formation of a democracy for the people who held this power and held a lot of power, like the landed plantation owners during this time, that they were considered incorruptible. If you had wealth, that meant that you didn't need wealth, and therefore you couldn't be corrupted by a desire to get things in order for your personal interests. You could put your personal interests aside and only act in the common good. And Washington believed in this as well. He felt that the word for it at the time was being disinterested. And so he felt that he was disinterested in society so he could commit to the common good. And that was another way in which he garnered trust and respect, was because he had the wealth not to be considered untrustworthy. So as he takes power in the presidency, Washington is thinking specifically about what he needs to do in that office. And I think it's really interesting because since Washington was the first president, he's not running on any policies. He doesn't have any issues that he's fighting for. In fact, Um, no promises that he's making. If you elect me, this will happen, because Washington is assumed to be the one to take this role. In fact, when they're designing the Constitution and they're figuring out the powers they want to give the executive, it's clear to everybody in the room that they're designing the job description for George Washington. And so, and many people think that the executive was given more power because they knew Washington could be trusted with that amount of power. And so as he comes into office, he's elected not on policies, but on his character, on his ability for his peers to trust him. And then we see the precedents and the policies he does enact when he's in office have a lot to do with ensuring unity, even at the detriment of going against sort of, his natural inclinations or the majority opinion. In particular, thinking about his enacting of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1793, which was specifically done to ensure amelioration of the southern states at this time, keeping everybody together. And again, similar to the circular to the states, the precedents that he set are ensuring this federal experiment survives. We have to remember that the nation at this time was so fragile, and that Washington's commitment to unity, singular-minded during his presidency, the decisions he was making was to say, like, let's make sure this democracy gets to the next generation. We want to hand it over to the people who didn't have to fight for it like we did. So events like the Whiskey Rebellion, like the French neutrality crisis and the Jay Treaty, the creation of the strong central bank, these were all done to ensure the economic and the political security of this tenuous relationship between the national and the state government, figuring out who was in power and who had rights to do things. So as Washington's in this position, it's not just policies, though. He's also really inventing how do you become a leader when you are elected by your peers. So even though he holds the highest office, he's really thinking about his role in a representative democracy. And so at this point, we really look at him asking himself, how do I show the people of this nation that I represent them? And two of the ways that he does this, the first is his trips. He takes northern and southern tours of the United States, making sure that he visits every state in the Union. And people in those states get a chance to see him, and he gets a chance to see them. It's weird to think about today when we know presidents can jet around the world, but leaving the center office in Philadelphia or New York and then Philadelphia, he's going to geographically disparate places and saying, I am your president. Because remember, these people don't know the national government. They think about their relationship to government as defined by the states. And so having a chance to actually interact with a representative from this national government in a meaningful way, the head of it, is one of the ways Washington is really thinking about, how do I demonstrate that I represent all of you, that this office represents the entire Union. And then the other way we see Washington do this is through his commitment to religious freedom. And he's really thinking about, not supporting, or just tolerating different religions than him, but really thinking about that the belief in a higher power, believing in something bigger than yourself, no matter what your religion is part of the democratic process and key to it. Because at the heart of being part of a democracy, Washington believes, is your commitment to put the community and the common good before yourself. And he believes the best way in which people do that is to believe in a higher power. And so he wants to make sure that any religion can be practiced in the United States. So as he's thinking about unity, he's thinking about how do we ensure that people can believe in something bigger than themselves, bigger than their state, and we seek out to support their belief in something bigger than themselves. So that religious freedom is a key part to his commitment to unity. And then Washington does meet the expectations of his peers. He does give up his power of the executive. There's no two-term limit in the first presidency, and Washington steps down after 8 years. And really also illustrates his commitment to this idea of the success of the government through that action. knowing that the most valuable thing that he can do as president is to ensure that peaceful transition of power to John Adams. And, Washington leaves record for all of us on his final ideas about his presidency through the farewell address that is published at the point that he steps down from office. It's a broken record, maybe. It's the same ideas he put forward in the Circular of the States, but it's a powerful one, this idea that we need to keep the Union whole. And he says it's going to be hard work, it's going to take time, but we will be rewarded if we commit to keeping the Union whole. For those of you who are fans of Hamilton and know the farewell address song, he talks about the ever favorite object of his heart is the self-governing democracy. It's not Martha Washington. It's the government, the favorite object of his heart. And, in that farewell address, all of his messages, are just reinforcing, parties are going to divide us. Other nations are going to try to pull us in different directions. But no, we have a commitment. And he speaks specifically a commitment to future generations to make sure that we keep this Union whole. So that's my thoughts on Washington and his shared characteristics for commitment to union.
Allison, thank you so much. I wasn't going to let you go through that without quoting Hamilton at least once, so I'm glad we covered that ground.
You want me to sing it?
We'll take it. Thank you so much. I will, before I share a couple of responses, just know we will have time for Q&A. We'll have a little bit of time for interactivity after we've heard from each of the speakers. You're also welcome to plug a question or a comment into the chat so that it can be on our radar. I should have said that at the outset, but please feel free to use the chat. You're encouraged to. I loved a couple of these points. In my work at the Partnership for Public Service, we study public service leadership, and we work with public servant leaders day in and day out. And a couple of the defining values that sets them apart is the stewardship of public trust and the commitment to public good. And you saw that from the very beginning with Washington, that he was a steward of the public's trust, that society over self principle, letting kind of his identity in a way be swallowed up in the country, and giving up a little bit of his personal views or his own sense of self in service to this society, this bigger cause. And you see that certainly, if I could just connect it to President Lincoln. One story that came to mind as you were talking, Allison, was after the war ended and the Confederacy had surrendered, Lincoln had a band play the Dixie song out in front of the White House. This is a Southern anthem. That is his way of saying we are one country. And he also told Grant, after this ends, it mustn't just be hangings. That we should let people go back to their lives, that we are one country. He was so intent on that sense of unity, as opposed to vengeance or retaliation, or all kinds of actions he probably maybe could have taken, and many probably wanted him to take. He resisted that in service to society, putting society over self. And he on the other end of things, as he was coming into Washington as the president-elect, he said in a speech, "I've never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." Very committed to those early principles that Washington really helped create. And it's fascinating to think how so much of this country is built around the character of Washington and the trust they put in him. And that role was in some ways crafted for him with a whole lot of trust, and to see how it's evolved since then. So thank you so much, Allison, for those thoughts. Again, we have some questions coming in. Please keep them coming, and we will now move chronologically down the line to LBJ, and we have a chance to hear from Mark Atwood Lawrence from the Presidential Library there. He's the director of the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum in Austin, Texas. Until January 2020, he taught as associate professor of history at UT Austin, where his classes focus on American and international history. Lawrence is author of Assuming the Burden, Europe and the American Commitment to War in Vietnam and the Vietnam War, a concise international history, as well as several edited books and numerous articles, chapters, and reviews on various aspects of the history of U.S. foreign relations. Lawrence has held the Cassius Marcellus Clay Fellowship at Yale University and the Stanley Kaplan Visiting Professorship in American Foreign Policy at Williams College. He earned a BA from Stanford University and his PhD from Yale University. He has recently completed a study of U.S. policymaking toward the Third World in the 1960s. Mark, pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you to everyone who had a hand in organizing this terrific event. I've been at work for quite a while studying presidential decision making, and I think sometimes, particularly in the academic study of decision making at the highest level, it can become very tempting to emphasize structural constraints, broad economic and political forces, to the point where we lose sight of the actual character of the individual in the Oval Office. And I'm very, very sympathetic to the approach that we're taking today of trying to talk somewhat narrowly about the character of the individual who ultimately bears the highest degree of responsibility. So I'm really excited to take part in this and to talk a little bit about the president who I probably know best, Lyndon Johnson. The problem with LBJ, of course, is knowing which character trait to focus on. As many commentators have suggested over many years, LBJ was surely one of the most complicated men ever to hold the presidency. I think one journalist, in reflecting on LBJ's character, put it pretty well when he said that LBJ was an overwhelming human being. He said, anything you want to say about him was true. Good, bad, compassionate, ruthless, everything. Another memoirist makes the same point in a different way in saying that virtually every adjective in the dictionary applies to LBJ. I think there's a lot to be said for this. So it's hard to know where to start, or it's hard to know how to choose, I suppose, one character trait that, that one should focus on to try to encapsulate the man, or at least something that's important about him. But it seems to me it's really important to make the effort as well. It seems to me that LBJ was, if I can put it this way, very much a creature of his personality, very much an ego-driven individual who had very little overlay of artistry or learning or intellectuality or anything along those lines. He was someone who succeeded and flourished best, I think, when the core of his personality was right out front. But still, okay, which character trait to choose? So I made I confess, a somewhat conventional choice in deciding to focus on LBJ's persuasiveness. That's the word of the moment here, persuasiveness. But I think it's indisputably a crucially important dimension of what makes LBJ stand out in American history and makes him particularly interesting as a model for thinking about the appropriate role of presidents and how good things can be accomplished via presidential leadership. There's no question, to put it differently, that one of his most striking characteristics as president was his exceptional ability to bend other people, whether it was voters or members of his cabinet or members of Congress, to his will. The result of Johnson's extraordinary persuasive powers was a presidency that achieved truly staggering results in promoting and signing into law a monumental array of transformative bills. I'd say many historians rank LBJ probably in the #2 position in terms of his simple effectiveness in supporting and adopting legislation, probably behind FDR, although that's probably a debate worth having. But the list, in any case, the list of major legislative accomplishments is absolutely breathtaking. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Medicare, Medicaid, the Immigration Act of 1965, the various components of the so-called war on poverty, the establishment of public broadcasting and the National Endowment for the Humanities and National Endowment for the Arts, landmark bills in education, the environment, consumer protections, law enforcement, and one could really go on and on and on. Well, how did LBJ accomplish so much? Something, of course, has to do with the nature of American politics in that particular moment, and that's something we could certainly talk about. But one answer clearly lies as well in his remarkable ability to persuade people around him, especially, I suppose, members of Congress, to share his goals, to work with him, to support his initiatives, to bring all of these pieces of legislation into effect. So remarkable was LBJ's ability to persuade that his techniques, his array of techniques, have acquired a label, as many of you will know, the so-called Johnson treatment. The Johnson treatment, and maybe this is the point where we could put up a photo, because I think photos really on this subject capture a lot more than what I can reasonably convey in mere words, but I'll give it a shot. The Johnson treatment entailed this enormous man, almost 6'4", oftentimes leaning into the personal space of the people with whom he was speaking, in this case, Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas, of breathing into their faces, sometimes holding the lapels of their jackets or putting his arms on the wall behind the poor person who was being subjected to the treatment. All in the service of insisting on his point of view and trying to bring his interlocutor around to his position. It was in certain ways a pure act of physicality. I think this is one of the things that many commentators from the time really picked up on about the Johnson treatment. But in any case, here's, and we can go to this is Abe Fortas I mentioned. This is the senator from Rhode Island, Theodore Green. Very similar shot, right? You can get a sense again of what this might have looked like and perhaps more importantly, felt like. But here's how the Johnson treatment was described by some people who either saw it or experienced, or maybe both. The newspaper columnist Mary McGrory described it as an incredible potent mixture of persuasion, badgering, flattery, threats, reminders of past favors and future advantages. The Washington Post editor, Ben Bradley, this is my favorite, recalled feeling after he had been subjected to this sort of thing that a Saint Bernard had licked your face for an hour and had pawed you all over. And Hubert Humphrey simply described it as a tidal wave. So some colorful ways of certainly of capturing this remarkable blend of persuasive techniques that LBJ could bring to bear. But let me try to break it down a little bit more and say just a little bit about some of the component parts of this arsenal of persuasive techniques that LBJ was apparently so adept at using. And I'll just touch briefly on 4 of these components of the Johnson treatment. First, LBJ was very adept at appealing to patriotism, to duty, and sometimes to duty to party as well as to nation. But he sought, in short, to appeal to his interlocutors on the basis of their obligations to some cause larger than themselves. Your president, right? Emphasis in LBJ's speaking of those words, just like mine. Your president, he would say on numerous occasions when he had someone on the telephone, really needs your vote on this bill. Your president, not I need your vote. Your president. Very, very quick with that kind of language. And the implication was often that if LBJ lost a vote, it would be a humiliation to him as the embodiment of the United States in some ways, but also to the party. He was careful to use party loyalty. He used it sometimes more than in others. Oftentimes he was reaching across the aisle to make these kinds of arguments to Republicans. And I'll have I'll have at least one example of that in just a quick moment here. He also, a second feature of the Johnson treatment, he played very skillfully on the ego or the vanity of the people with whom he interacted. He was quick, in other words, to suggest that particularly members of Congress in supporting the administration's goals would also serve their own political purposes and their own reputations. And the classic example of this, which I can't resist using, particularly given the importance of Abraham Lincoln to our theme today, comes from a conversation that LBJ had in 1964 with the Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, the senator from Illinois. And LBJ was desperately trying to reach across the aisle to get Republican votes in support of this momentous civil rights legislation. And he is thrilled with the possibility that he might not only get Senator Dirksen, but of course, Senator Dirksen was a very important figure in his party, and getting him would also presumably make it much easier to get other Republican moderates on the side of the civil rights legislation. So what does LBJ says? He says to Dirksen, "You're worthy of the land of Lincoln, and the man from Illinois is going to pass the bill. And I'll see that you get proper attention and credit," right? So there's something generous here about giving credit across the aisle. Famously, after LBJ signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the first pen that he gave out to the array of people standing behind him was not to Martin Luther King, was not to Hubert Humphrey, was not to a member of his own party, but was to Everett Dirksen. But clearly, in addition to the sort of noble effort here to share credit where credit was due, is also an attempt to play on the vanity and reputation of someone who would be very likely to be susceptible to that kind of appeal. A third part of LBJ's persuasive toolkit, if I can call it that, was, one has to admit, his willingness to strong arm or perhaps even intimidate people whose cooperation he needed. There's a couple of fascinating examples of this sort of thing that I'll touch on here just very, very briefly. Very early on in LBJ's presidency, very shortly after JFK's assassination, LBJ is in the business of putting together the Warren Commission, this committee that would investigate the circumstances of JFK's assassination. And LBJ desperately wanted his political mentor and close friend, Richard Russell, the senator from Georgia, to be part of that committee. And he gets Russell on the phone. We know about this because of these marvelous phone tapes that have come from the LBJ library over the last many years now. He gets Russell on the phone. He's trying to make the case, and Warren is saying, "No, I really don't want to do this. I especially don't want to do this because I can't stand Chief Justice Earl Warren. Please let me out of this. Please, 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 not me, anybody but me." And LBJ says, well, he's actually already announced it to the press, right? So the information has already been made public. Russell still resists in a way, asks for more time. But in the end, Russell caves. "I won't turn you down. I'll do whatever you say," is just the grand finale of that conversation. LBJ takes a similar approach in February 1964, just a few weeks later, with Sergeant Shriver, who at this point was head of the Peace Corps. He was, of course, John F. Kennedy's brother-in-law. LBJ calls up Shriver and says, "Hey, not only do I want you to continue to be the head of this newly established agency, the Peace Corps, but I also want you to run the domestically focused war on poverty for you." And LBJ pulls from the same bag of tricks. Shriver protests, says, "Well, let me at least think about it. Give me the weekend." Literally says, "Give me the weekend." And LBJ says, "Oh, the press conference is already set up for this afternoon." And Shriver backs down. LBJ says, "You've just got to do it. You can't let me down. Right? You can't let me down. Let the presidency down," I think is slightly between the lines there. And then finally, I'll just mention that humor also, which I know is our next theme, was part of LBJ's bag of persuasive tricks. And my favorite example on this comes from the summer of 1964. LBJ is again on the phone. We know about this from the transcripts of the phone conversations. He's on the phone with a member of his own party, a member of the House from the Texas Panhandle, a guy named George Mahan. And Mahan, of course, represents one has to recognize, a decidedly landlocked part of the country, Lubbock, Texas. And LBJ is going back and forth with Mahan about Mahan's attitude toward the poverty bill. He knows that Mahan's vote is one of the ones he really has to get. It seems gettable, but Mahan's kind of holding out. And LBJ says, "Look, George, I'll move the US Navy to Lubbock if that's what it takes to get your vote for this bill." One of my favorite moments in all of those conversations. LBJ doesn't do that a lot, but there are some moments in these conversations that are absolutely hysterical. So there are a lot more other elements of LBJ's persuasive techniques that we could perhaps focus on. We could even address those in the question time if you like. But I'll conclude just by saying, of course, these persuasive techniques did not, in the end, get LBJ everything he wanted. His standing declines, as I think we all know, pretty rapidly after 1965, as both the left and the right of the American political spectrum increasingly become skeptical of the administration, if not turn against him in a significant way. His skill in, and I think this is an important point about LBJ, his skill in interpersonal relationships that I've been talking about here did not necessarily mean that he was especially skilled at reading the larger public mood. Those are two different skills, perhaps, two different character traits, to put it in the language of today's event, that we might be interested in distinguishing between. But I think there's no question that for a time in 1964 and 5 in particular, LBJ operated with a level of effectiveness that was really staggering, that very few, if any, presidents have really ever come close to in all of American history. So I'll stop there and thank you all very much for your attention.
There are several questions that have come in, and one of them is a very quick question, I think. And so I will go ahead and ask that one. Allison, it's going to be for you. The question is from Teft Smith. Did Washington write the farewell address, or was it Hamilton?
Oh, good question. Washington knew how to delegate. And actually, the first draft of the farewell address was written by Madison after the first term in presidency, after his first term, because that's when he was planning on stepping down, but they convinced him to run for a second. So Hamilton and Washington worked from Madison's draft to create that second one. There's a great document at the New York Historical Society, I think, that shows it's in Hamilton's handwriting, the farewell address, and you see Washington's comments throughout it, and all of his edits and changes. So they definitely worked as a team, but especially if you compare it with Washington's ideas since the beginning of time, or since the Circular States, those are all of his ideas expressed, certainly with the support of Hamilton.
Mark, thank you so much. Thanks for talking about the complexity of this individual. We can't pretend that any of these leaders have got it all figured out and that they have arrived in any way. There's complexity to them, and you showed that well. When you talked about persuasion, I couldn't help, I pulled Team of Rivals off my shelf, which is Doris Kearns Goodwin's wonderful book on Lincoln's political genius, as she calls it. There's a section where he meets Frederick Douglass for the first time. And you get both the physicality that you're talking about, Mark, as well as the persuasiveness. Douglass is upset that Lincoln hasn't taken action when the Confederacy basically passed an ordinance dooming to death or slavery every Negro taken in arms. So while we were recruiting a lot of new Black soldiers, they were now all of a sudden at risk of going back into slavery or killed if they were caught. And Lincoln hasn't put anything out yet. Douglass comes to meet him, and he says, I was minutes after presenting his card, he was called into the office, so he went ahead of others. And I was never more quickly or more completely put at ease in the presence of a great man than in that of Abraham Lincoln. The president was seated in a chair when Douglass entered the room, surrounded by a multitude of books and papers. His feet and legs were extended in front of his chair. On my approach, he slowly drew his feet in from the different parts of the room into which they had strayed, and he began to rise. And then Douglass begins to introduce himself, and Lincoln says, "I know who you are. Mr. Seward has told me all about you. Sit down, I'm glad to see you." And Douglass is immediately caught by his transparent countenance, is what he calls it. And then they discuss, Lincoln listens intently, and then they basically make a decision. Douglass, as they're leaving, Lincoln notes a criticism that Douglass had made of him in a fiery speech, that he had been tardy, hesitating, and vacillating. And Lincoln says he concedes that he might have been frustrating with his deliberation on issues, but it cannot be shown, I think it cannot be shown that when I have taken a position, I've ever retreated from it. And that commitment and that persuasion showed up hand in hand. And as Douglass leaves, it says he would never forget this first meeting, during which he felt as though I could put my hand on his shoulder. Which I think, again, is a beautiful statement for these two very different people working together, and shows Lincoln's persuasive abilities. So we'll continue the conversation, and let's move now to Janet, and to allow me to introduce her. Janet Tran serves as the Director of Learning and Leadership for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. She helped design the foundation's nonpartisan civic learning portfolio, answering President Reagan's call for an informed patriotism. In 2015, she established the Reagan Institute offices in Washington, D.C., with the launch of Leadership and the American Presidency, and the inaugural Reagan Institute Summit on Education, on the 35th anniversary of the semi-annual report, A Nation at Risk. Janet's civic mission, serving as a teacher leader in Los Angeles. She earned her bachelor's from the University of California and her master's of education in curriculum and instruction at California State University. She earned her doctorate in education learning technologies at Pepperdine University. Janet, so glad to have you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, and to my favorite people, the organizers of this event from President Lincoln's Cottage and my presidential cousins from 116 and 36. It's always a privilege and a joy to learn more, because I think that when we look at a president, they have so many templates to follow and learn from before, and those who take precedent seriously, no president is who they are without the previous ones. And I had the joy of speaking today about a character trait that may seem superficial and maybe trite, and but ultimately there's a subtext, and that trait is humor, and in particular President Reagan's humor, because it's more than what it seems. Much like one of his heroes, President Reagan looked to President Lincoln, who used humor and approached his leadership journey with much humility and used it in a variety of ways. Both men enjoyed a good, funny story, an allegory, but I'll spare you any of my mediocre delivery of those stories because you need comedic timing. And that's not something I've worked on during my time of my tenure here. So I think those, the pieces are the humble beginnings and ultimately that ability to bring people to common cause. And we started this conversation with being and doing. And I want to speak about humor as both a tactic and as a value. And what I mean with a tactic is President Reagan could seem like a very disarming, jovial, elderly man, your grandfather, just love to have him around. You felt warm by a fireplace. But how do you lead 8 years with a Democratic Congress and get a lot done for the American people? So both sides never had, complementary houses or presidencies. And similarly, this is also the only president who actually has served as a union president. And he always joked that, arguing labor disputes was actually far more, terrifying than arguing across the ocean with the General Secretary Gorbachev. So those experiences, you really have to be disarming. And amidst really tense conversations, somehow be respectful. And that went from speaking with leaders to his relationship with the media, who often didn't cover his policies positively. But as Ann Compton, the first female White House correspondent, always said, the sun always shone when President Reagan walked into the Rose Garden. And even if you weren't covering him in a positive way, or he was a little irritated with you, it just somehow that sunshine would come back. And it was very irritating to a lot of the White House press corps that, wanted to dig at him sometimes. The other piece of the tactic that we want to look at is it leads people astray. So his love of stories would often drive people to the brink. It's like, why are you telling a pony story in the midst of this extremely important negotiation? But people would leave meetings realizing that their objectives weren't met, but the president had covered his. Or that humor would allow him to really obfuscate the goals of the meeting. For those in a certain age group, you might remember that SNL skit with Phil Hartman playing President Reagan, and he's this cheerful gentleman who's doing like photo ops, but ultimately when the doors are closed, masterminding things. And historian Steve Hayward says that's probably a more accurate picture of President Reagan, which is putting up the shining face, perhaps some of the skills, that was learned from his Hollywood days, to really thinking about how to get things done behind the scenes. But I think the more important aspect about humor probably is the premise of humor as a value. Like, why do we love people with a sense of humor? when people make you laugh, what are they saying? You know, and for me, I believe it means that they're placing your comfort, your joy, your happiness above their own. It's saying that I matter if someone is going out of their way to make me laugh. And it's important to bring joy to individuals. And then that humor means that it's rooted in humility, in a sense that in spite of being the leader of the free world, perhaps the most important person in the space, generally the majority of those 8 years, he felt it was more important that you felt at ease. And I think those pieces are really important when we think about humor as a value. Similarly, why do we dislike people without a sense of humor? You know, I think, you know, you'd imagine, well, this person thinks they're better than us. They take themselves too seriously. You know, even while the media heavily criticized, as I mentioned, President Reagan, he was always a presence and a riot at the White House Correspondents' Dinners. And I urge you to look some of these up. They're absolutely hysterical, some of the implications and his participation and his willingness to laugh at himself. And perhaps this comes from those humble beginnings that, you know, Andrew, you spoke about for President Lincoln, which is, you know, this young man grew up in the Depression. His father was an alcoholic. His family, you know, did not have much. He would not have been able to attend college without what they called back then a needy student scholarship from Eureka. And ultimately, you know, he was brought back to Eureka time and time again on the basis of his character. It was his football coach who continually encouraged him to come back and contribute to the team. And I assure you, it wasn't because he was an all-star player. He had very poor vision and he was not able to be the greatest lineman out there. It was what he added as a leader on the field. So again, certainly many will cite his time in Hollywood for that comedic timing from the tactician standpoint. And that's certainly true. But really, it's that small town American experience that instills those values. And perhaps another really interesting sort of feature to lay the groundwork of where he developed the tactic and the value is he's probably the only American president who had the privilege of meeting and hearing from thousands of Americans, not in the context of a presidential campaign. He served as a GE spokesperson for many years. And this required him to just ride a train and walk the lines of GE factories and speak to the American people, hear them, listen to them, and understand their story, and of course, relate to them. And that's a privilege that I'm not sure many folks, especially in this modern age, in the constant whirl of campaign, would have the opportunity to understand an average American, their struggles and their joys, and really relating with them one-on-one through every, you know, town in America. So I think I'll start with a little unknown or the most known story, you know, regarding President Reagan's humor. And I'll give you a trigger warning for those folks who did watch this cycle's debates, because it is a debate story. It was his debate against Walter Mondale. And President Reagan at the time, he was the oldest candidate to run for president. At 73, a veritable spring chicken, I suppose, in this race. But it was really controversial at the time to say, are you able to take on the job? Are you fit? Are you healthy? Are you well? And it was a constant chatter in the campaign, you know, in spite of really, really strong approval ratings and, you know, ultimately what he felt were legislative accomplishments and the ability to work across the aisle, a great team that was assembled. So he's asked again at the debate, you know, are you too old to do this job? And they're not talking about issues at the time. And President Reagan is you know, somewhat annoyed that this is the case, but he doesn't let on because he's got a sense of humor. And he answers, you know, not at all. I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I'm not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience. And in which case, the moderator, who is a journalist, and his opponent, Walter Mondale, they can't help but laugh. And, you know, Walter Mondale, you know, it wasn't laughing at him. We were all just having a good laugh together. And that also effectively ends the line of questioning that campaign cycle from this witty incumbent senior president, and opens up the floor to something that's really important that I think the American people are entitled to, which is, open, honest debate about the issues when you're running for president of the United States. The second story I'm pleased to share with you is it's lesser known, and it's it's about the president's relationship with the American people as well, which is he answered letters to the American people, approximately 10 a week. I believe a couple of other presidents have continued that tradition as well. But he gets one from sassy 13-year-old Andy Smith of Irmo, South Carolina. And Andy is writing, seeking federal assistance. So he wrote, "Today, my mother declared my bedroom a disaster area, and I would like to request federal funds to hire a crew to clean up my room." So President Reagan says, many people might say this is hilarious, send a standard response, whatever the case is. In handwritten letter, he responds to him, and he not only responds, but he uses the opportunity as a civics lesson for young Andy. And he has to regretfully reject his application for disaster relief because he notes there's a real technical problem, which is the authority declaring the disaster is supposed to make the request. So in that case, your mother, Andy, should be making this request. So he has to deny the application. But he also, takes a moment to explain that there's a lot of volunteer programs available that he could set up. And in many cases, localities are able to do this job better than the federal government, and that there is a scarcity since there's a lot of natural disasters happening. He's writing to Andy essentially as a peer and as a citizen. And with that belief that he always said America's best days are ahead. So he's not writing off a 13-year-old kid. He values Andy. He values Andy's mom. He actually says, "Give my regards to your mom" at the end of the letter, knowing that she probably has her hands full with Andy. So I think that one is a lovely insight into how much he valued the future of Americans. The last story I'll gather, or the last sort of example, and there are many, again, ranging from irritating to obfuscating to, to just wily and fun, is a series of just incredibly unbelievable, really, responses during a trying time. And ultimately, your character is truly revealed in times of crisis. So before his first 100 days are up in office, President Reagan is a victim of an assassination attempt. And the injury and is far more serious than the American people even know. His life was on the line. There was his suit, which we hold at the Presidential Library. It shows it's very close to his heart. There's quite a bit of blood loss. But through all of this, it's more important that the people around him not worry about him. So the moment he gets into the operating room, he looks to his surgeons and says, "Please tell me you're Republicans." To his wife, who is just, obviously distraught, he looks at her and says, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And then the next day, to his White House aides who come rushing in, who have been waiting to see him, he looks at them and says, "Hi, fellas. I knew it would be too much to hope that we could skip a staff meeting today." So all of these individuals are in a moment where presidential succession is in conversation. This is a country in crisis. And here's a man who is just very thoughtful about, he's loath to inconvenience people. The thought that people are worrying about him is troubling to him. And even more, there's many stories of his humility, of how he was cleaning up after himself when, he spilled water. There's also a pretty key player who shows up by his bedside, his good friend, Speaker Tip O'Neill. So imagining in today's context, his good friend, the speaker, is pretty tough between a president and a speaker of opposing parties. But Speaker O'Neill is actually the first person outside of family to show up by his bedside. And he kneels in prayer with President Reagan because these two men have shared a ton of belly laughs amidst their blows to one another. So while in combat, if you were, they were in tense situations. But one of the photos that we have at the Presidential Library is a photo of both President Reagan and the giant Speaker O'Neill just, belly laughing. But what people don't know about that photo is prior to that, it was an intense argument over whether or not to bring a bill to the floor. And ultimately, Speaker O'Neill, who was against it, does President Reagan that favor and brings the bill to the floor. He votes against it, of course. That's his ideology. But ultimately, both men were really committed to a government that worked and debate that brought and surfaced the best ideas. And it came from that relationship they built that they always joked that they would, they could spar it out, but after 5 o'clock, they could have a beer together. So they always would look forward to that time where they could have those big belly laughs. And sometimes when things got really rough, they would say, let's pretend it's 5 o'clock because, we wanted to make sure we leveled and got back to the heart of humor, right? Which is this premise that other people are important to you, that you are at their service. So, what's so critical about that is being a president isn't, being someone's boss or being the leader. Really, we are the boss of the president of the United States. So it's of service. And I think that's what the heart of this value that is so important. It conveys optimism, it conveys efficacy, and it allowed him to build a relationship with a global superpower, such as the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, allowed him to, work with his rival and political, a guy across the aisle, the Speaker of the House, and, ultimately allows him to, you don't make an adversary of an enemy, and you aren't a leader to rule people, but to serve. And those two things are really stand out when you look at humor as a value. And I think I'll end with something that is, often said, which is, character is who you are when no one else is looking. And from, his chief of staff for a long time, Joanne Drake, to, White House photographer, now Twitter sensation, Pete Souza, they've always said the same thing, which is he treated the person who carried the broom, who served him a sandwich, the same as he treated a chief of staff, a head of state, or the Queen of England. It was it's something in the way that you value individuals. And I think that's where we look at humor as such an important trait to build those connections, but also as a value and as a way to place people who are dear to you, in particular the American people. His children always said America was a tough sibling to be a rival to. But ultimately, it is this value of someone else above you when you have a sense of humor and when you deliver that humor for others to enjoy. So I'll pause there and hand the floor back to you.
Janet, we had one person make a comment about Reagan that I wanted to share with you. This comes from Andrea. She said Reagan was also very funny at Gridiron Club and Alfalfa Club dinners and roasts. Do you want to have a quick comment on that while we wait for Andrew to come back in?
Yeah, I think he really enjoyed these sort of opportunities, and but they weren't making fun of people. They were very much we're all laughing together. I will go into I believe it was at one of these dinners or mixing up with the White House correspondence, but he shows a little slideshow of his negotiations with the Soviets, which is obviously very intense. And there's at one moment he's like, oops, and he pretends that he's showing these photos accidentally on the slideshow. And there's one of, their folks arm wrestling, just joking around. And there's one that's implying that Nancy Reagan is infatuated with the general secretary. He is not taking himself seriously. And I think that's, it's endearing, but it's also, it is true that the president is but a citizen and returning to, office of citizen, as President Washington did, is ultimately the most important part of the job, right? To be of service and then to return as Cincinnatus did.
Okay, thanks for your patience. We all go through these things and this is not the time to do it, but here we are. Thanks for your patience. And thank you, Janet. Really enjoyed that. And I love that point around humor and humanity and the connection between humor and humanity. That there is something authentic about the leader that can share a joke especially joke about themselves. And that self-deprecation can go so far in connecting with people. It exposes a little bit of vulnerability. And Lincoln certainly was not afraid of this either. He was not afraid to derail a cabinet meeting with a joke or a story or a poem, and sometimes to the frustration of people like his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. But he would proceed with that because of how it could break the tension, because of how it could create a sense of community and connection. He in one of his debates with Stephen Douglas early on, he was called two-faced during the debate. So we have another debate story here, so apologies. But he said, if I were two-faced, would I be wearing this one? Just very quick to make that joke, to make light of himself, and probably win some supporters in the process of a little bit of humor. So again, thanks for sharing that. We are now going to give you a chance to reflect a little bit on your own character and take you through just a very simple exercise, and then we'll go to Q&A. So please tell me if I have any audio issues. I'm seeing that people are hearing, so we're okay right now. Good. I want to invite everybody to think of a leader that they've worked with who they admire. Someone that they've worked with directly, that they've seen up close. And what is it about that individual that you admired? You are welcome at this point to either come off mute and share, or put it into the chat. A leader that you've worked with, you admired, and something specific about them that stood out, that you still remember. I'll just give a few moments for reflection, and then if anyone would like to jump in on the line or over the chat, please feel free.
Andrew?
Yes, Richard.
This is Richard Moe. Yeah, I'm sorry I came in late, but very much enjoying the conversation. And thanks to Aaron for leadership, putting these things on. I've been involved in the Lincoln Cottage for some time. And but my first introduction to a presidential library was at Hyde Park, where I was doing some research for on a book for Franklin Roosevelt. And he famously said in 1932 that the presidency is preeminently a place of moral leadership. And I would just like to ask the panel a question of how morality fits into the interpretation of presidential sites that they're familiar with, if it does at all. Is it a fair question or is it not? Anyway, morality. I worked in Jimmy Carter's White House, so I have some strong feelings about this, particularly as it relates to human rights. But anyway, let me just throw it open. It's an interesting question, I think.
Great, Richard. Thank you for the question. Let's come back to that when we come to the Q&A in just a moment.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No problem. The morality and morality's role in the office of the president. Thank you for that. Want to see if there are any perspectives on the admired leader and what is it about that person that you most admire that still is with you today?
Am I coming through?
Yes, you are. You were commenting on the traits of Carter that you admired, so maybe you want to elaborate on that a bit.
The traits, there are many things to admire about Jimmy Carter that go contrary to the popular impression of his presidency. Unfortunately, there are a number of books coming out on Carter now that are changing that perception, much as David McCullough's book on Truman changed the perception of Harry Truman. But the thing that he was most known for and the thing that he cared most about was his commitment to human rights, which both at home and abroad. He made it the central point of his foreign policy, and he appointed more women, minorities, and other blacks to judgeships and high positions in the administration than all of his predecessors combined, because he thought it was the right thing to do. So he was very principled about human rights, which has now virtually disappeared from our national agenda. Sadly, I think we'll see whether we can bring it back. But anyway, that's what I really most admired about Jimmy Carter.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, for sharing that inclusivity, which is something we're also seeing in the chat. Valerie talks about an inclusive democratic leader she had as a first manager who listened to all sides. And we're seeing others too. I think Teff Smith, I think you wanted to come in with a comment. Please feel free.
Yeah, well, the thing that I felt was most important was the presidents who could build consensus. And you talked about, we heard the discussion about LBJ being able to compel consensus, and then obviously Reagan being able to do that, and the ability to reach across the aisle and bring bipartisanship, which is, I think, what was part of the message that George Washington gave in the farewell address. And obviously, in the last several years, and I'm talking the last really almost 2 decades, we've had very little ability to see much bipartisan activity. And yet, to me, Richard had talked about, and rightfully, moral leadership, but moral leadership isn't just about a specific thing. It's actually providing real consensus leadership, which is what it is that our Constitution sort of is presupposed upon, is the notion of some kind of negotiated compromise, which is why we have the checks and balances. So that is the thing that stands out most to me when I think about presidential leadership is, can the person actually do what they all say they're going to do, which is reach across the aisle and be the president of all Americans, as opposed to being, as we've seen, rabidly partisan. So thanks for allowing me to make those comments.
Thank you, Teff. And I think that aligns really nicely with the comments in the chat, where we're seeing leaders we admire are going to bring out the voice of each person. We've got this beautiful, it could be a metaphor, but it's a literal example of a choir that Allison brings, bringing out the contribution of every single singer. We have the example from Barbara, someone who was deeply connecting, building bridges across diverse communities, and respecting stories and voices, bringing out untold stories. It's always fascinating to me that people often arrive at their leadership positions based on their resume or what's on paper, what they've done. When what we admire and what we remember is who they are. And it's those values that outlast them. And I've done this kind of an exercise many times where you'll look at the technical skills, the IQ, and then the emotional quotient and the character. The character is always the place that we value most, at least in reflection. It's not always what we put as a precedent when maybe we're hiring someone, we're looking at their resume, or we're voting for someone, we're looking at their platform. But remember that character. And I would invite you, we're going to get into questions. Just a final prompt would be to think about your own core values. And how will you be remembered? If someone were asked this question about you in some future time, what value would come out? What part of your character would be pronounced? Lincoln has had the misfortune of having 15,000 books written about him. And there's so many ways to look at this person. And you look at some of the titles of these books and you see The Political Genius. You see With Malice Toward None. There's another one with Charity for All. A Life of Purpose and Power. Lincoln's Melancholy. There's what would your biography say? What would the title be? How would it reflect your character? So I'll leave you with that prompt and a challenge for each of you to commit to your character, to commit to your values, and let them show up in behaviors that people could speak about at a future date, like we are here today. With that, want to open it up for time for questions, which we have now. Mark, let's start with you. One of the questions here, and we won't probably get to each of these around LBJ, but I do think there's an interesting one based on your research on Vietnam. he had many successes domestically, but how did leadership and character play into Vietnam? Were his tactics as effective abroad as they were here?
Yeah, thank you. Clearly not. I think one of the real challenges with trying to come up with a holistic impression of LBJ and to evaluate him in a general way is to try to reconcile the Vietnam record with the domestic Great Society record. How could he be so successful and triumphant in one sphere and so catastrophically, so much catastrophic failure in the other? And of course, you put 100 historians in a room, you get 100 different answers to this question. My own sense, to put it in basic terms, is that LBJ's priority was always the domestic agenda. More than anything, this is where he wanted to make his mark. It's where he had really built his political career, starting in the New Deal. He really didn't want to get derailed by foreign policy, but he believed that he had to escalate in Vietnam in order to prevent Vietnam from becoming a political problem for him in a way that would prevent him from achieving the other objectives. So I think it really helps to understand LBJ's Vietnam record to recognize how much energy he wanted to put in, he did put in, and wanted to put in still more into the domestic arena. He may have, we could certainly critique him in retrospect for having made a very faulty choice, but I think if you put yourself back in his shoes in 1964 and 1965, he was really trying first and foremost via escalation to prevent Vietnam from becoming a political disaster that would ruin his effectiveness in any other arena, including the Great Society.
Thanks, Mark. And while we've got you, let's ask one more of you. And then if there are, again, additional questions around Washington or Reagan. But there's this question around, do you think that JFK chose LBJ as his VP, not only for the regional implications for the election, but because he was almost too powerful in the Senate? Like the character was maybe too forceful, and Kennedy wanted him out of the way. What do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting line of thought. I will say this: I'm not aware of any particular piece of evidence that would lead directly to that conclusion, but it sort of stands to reason, right, that this might have been part of the stew of reasons that Kennedy and his campaign people had in mind in selecting LBJ. I think there are unquestionably other factors that should probably rank higher in the list, simply the geographic balance, the name recognition that LBJ brought with him, the portions of the Democratic Party that he could bring. But I would acknowledge that surely the logic that stands behind this question must have occurred to various people in making that choice, and it was probably reason 7, 8, or 9 on that list.
Great, thank you. Other questions for our panelists, our experts here, either over the chat or on the line. Jason's asking, Janet, if there's an example of when humor went wrong, with the example of joking on a live broadcast that was taken seriously and caused fear among citizens.
Right. I believe you said something like the missiles are about to launch in XY in 5 seconds or whatnot. Certainly the General Secretary did not appreciate his trust but verify multitude of usage, and there was a lot of tactics and obviously distrust from decades of diplomacy that had taken place. And the Soviets used a tactic of translation, which they certainly, many of them did not need and were very fluent in English. And President Reagan used his own, which was to run through old Russian jokes and tell stories and tell the story of how the Soviets could also make fun. He said in America you can make fun of the president, and in Russia you can also go and say I hate President Reagan. And so there was it was very icy in a lot of those negotiations, and there's no doubt one of them famously broke down with both gentlemen departing and leaving. Though many look back at the grand strategy and say maybe that was part of the theatrics as well. I don't want to skip the morality question, because I think that was a really powerful one that I would love to hear from, from Allison and Mark as well. But it really strikes me that, aside from, occasionally humor going astray, I think that is, there's no tactic that is 100% foolproof, even from the most irritatingly likable of fellows, right? But I really like the morality question, because I think what we're looking at is, a country that statistically we're showing is deeply polarized, that has fear of the others. And I think the difference is, there is a role for morality in the presidency. And certainly President Reagan approached the office with a sense of faith as a guiding principle. He had a strong affiliation and attachment to one of his partners, Pope John Paul II. He felt, surviving his assassination attempt, it meant that he had a debt to be paid, even more so to the American people. But I want to differentiate from that sense of morality that leads you to do what you believe is right, and what perhaps would be better called righteousness today. Because if you have righteousness, you operate as if you are in an absolute state of right, the state of correctness. And if you are righteous in the way you approach the office of the presidency, that is the exact opposite of humility. And those who are righteous would say, I can use any tactic I want to achieve my means. And that is not, I would argue, how President Reagan approached the office. He did approach it with a sense of morality as guidance, but he was also very pragmatic. And I'd argue that the presidents who came before him also were very prudent as well in terms of achieving their goals and what they believed ultimately they wanted. But he approached every negotiation in good faith. And I think that's really important when we're talking about morality, which is, going to your rival, even your enemy, and negotiating in good faith. But if you're righteous, you can justify bad faith negotiations, and you can justify a slew of things that are very, at the end of the day, anti-democratic. So I just wanted to make sure and honor that question as well.
Thank you, Janet. And I think it would be wonderful to hear Mark's and Allison's perspective on morality in the office of the president. Allison?
Well, I will just, address the fact that, morality in George Washington, is tied up with him being a slave owner, and anybody who enslaves human beings, can't be sort of recognized, even at the time, is recognized for moral failings. So it's not just a president's judgment on it. He was held in judgment by people at the time for his moral failings in supporting and continuing being a slave owner. So I think that's one of the reasons why I really focus on the shared values that we have with Washington in the past. As we look at his own questioning of his own beliefs, we do see his relationship to the institution of slavery changing. We have less records of his relationship to individual people who were enslaved. But the key thing when we think about his own beliefs, he's very private about his religious beliefs. But we do see that he stops taking communion after the Revolutionary War. There's a change in his relationship that he never speaks about. But this idea of his morals is for Washington very private. And he wants to be recognized for his policy, for his governing, for his public face.
Thanks, Allison. Mark?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question very much. I think I would distinguish between morality as a factor that operates in the minds of policymakers, that guides their decisions, that shapes their approach to the world on the one hand, and morality as a policy to be pursued in and of itself, if that makes sense. And I would look to some of the presidents like LBJ, like Eisenhower, who I think who used morality more in that first sense. They had a moral vision, but they didn't talk about it much. It wasn't right out there in front. And I think something happens with American politics in the 1970s as a consequence of Watergate, which leads people to want more morality in public life, and in the kind of political and social reaction against the 1960s that encourages people to think that social licentiousness had gone too far in the United States. And the combination pushes morality as an agenda to be pursued to the fore. And I think very broadly speaking, I would say that that's put the United States in a tougher spot where, among other problems, it's very difficult to achieve consensus or bipartisan agreement anymore because everyone is attached to their moral vision. And how do you back down from moral vision once you put that out there? So I think something happens with Carter and Reagan, and those two individuals might not be the best examples of this, but they start the country down that road of talking about morality as something that exists as a political cause that empowers certain parts of the electorate in a way that really diminishes the chance for true bipartisanship and consensus.
Thank you, Mark. We're wrapping up here. But Mark, there is this question around who persuaded whom between LBJ and Representative Bill McCullough. Can you very quickly just respond to that?
Absolutely. I wish I knew more off the top of my head about Representative McCullough, but unquestionably, he was a major figure in promoting the Civil Rights Act, what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a Republican from Ohio, worked very closely with JFK, and then after Kennedy's assassination with LBJ. And, when Janet was talking very eloquently about the relationship between Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, I had seen that question in the chat, and I was thinking, that it's something quite similar, right? It's reaching across the aisle and finding common ground, more than common ground, actually very similar vision with someone from the other party, and I think it's it clearly is an example of something that's all too rare in American politics in recent decades.
Thanks, Mark. And I'm going to pass over to Aaron. My concluding thought to answer your question, Barbara, is to continue to think of character as you're going to the polls, whether you're voting for the president next week or in 4 years, or any member of any candidate for anything. Consider character and consider your own character and cultivate it in those around you. If we can all push it forward, it can still be a big part of the narrative of this country, which is important for, I think, our future. So thank you all. It's been a pleasure. Aaron, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you again, Andrew, Allison, Mark, and Janet for a truly thought-provoking program. Thank you again to our sponsor, the Hassenberg Heart Group at Merrill, and a special thanks to each of you who attended today for being knowledge seekers and engaged citizens in our democracy. It's always these programs enrich us as much as we hope they enrich and inspire all of you. So thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful day. And if you haven't already voted, I hope you have a plan for doing so. Thank you all, and take care.